Bir varmış, bir yokmuş. Once there was, once there was not. Once there was a padishah, a king who ruled the world, but alas could not rule his own fate. For fate had denied him the thing he wanted more than anything else, and that was a son, for he and his wife were so lonely. Now one day the padishah went on a long pleasure walk in the wilderness. He came upon a meadow in the middle of which there grew a birch tree. As he rested his head on the ground at the foot of that tree, all of a sudden the earth began to shake and shake and shake. And when he woke up from his sleep, there before him stood a man with a long white beard and a long cloak of black wool. Salam alaikum. Greetings to you, said the stranger to the padishah. Alaikum salam, replied the padishah. Now, my king, said the stranger, what is it that you seek more than anything in the world? And to this the king smiled back at the stranger, saying, surely if you know that I am the king, surely you know what I long for. And at those words the stranger smiled back and took from his long black sleeve an apple as red as a pomegranate. Take this apple, he said to the king. Slice it in two. One piece give to your wife, and the other piece keep for yourself. And if you do this, you will finally receive what you so long for. And so the king returned to his wife and did everything the stranger instructed him to do. And then 9 months, 9 hours, and 9 minutes later, finally they received what both of them had longed for. They received a son. And they were so happy that they now had a son. As he grew up, they could not refuse him anything he asked of them. Ata, father, said the boy one day, build me a palace. And once the request was made, the king called craftsmen from Iznik and Khorasan to build the most beautiful palace that ever was. Ata, father, said the boy the other day, around my palace plant me the most magnificent gardens in the world. And at the request once again, the king called the best gardeners in the world to plant a garden worthy of Erum, of paradise itself. Ata, father, asked the boy one more time, in my garden, place 2 fountains, one fountain of butter and the other of honey. And once the request was made, within those splendid gardens, there were 2 fountains, one of butter and one of honey. And on a long summer day, the prince was sitting in his garden, admiring his 2 fountains, one of butter and one of honey. And then all of a sudden he saw that there was a hedge that went back and forth. And from that hedge there emerged a woman that had the dust of a long travel on her brow. She was cracking a cracked pitcher in her arms, and she was approaching one of those fountains of butter and honey to draw from it. Well, this incensed the prince. How dare a mere stranger come to his fountains? So he took a pebble that was right beside him, and he aimed it for that pitcher that woman was carrying. And when it struck the pitcher, it broke it in 2. And the poor woman gave a terrible heave and sigh. And she looked to the prince, and she said this, I have come a long way. I have come a long way to obtain the taste of butter and honey for my children, something that they have never known, something that they have forever longed for. And now you have ruined it all. And so one day it will be you who will long for something that you will have not seen, and the longing will poison you for the rest of your days. And with those words, the woman left the prince. But the prince didn't give it a second thought, for he had always gotten what he asked for. He didn't know what this stranger was talking about. But that evening, the prince had a dream. And in his dream, he dreamt of 3 orange Peri, 3 orange fairies, each with long black blue hair and eyes of sapphire. They were so bewitching, so entrancing that when he woke up the next morning, he could not get them out of his mind. And he went to his father. Ata, father, bring me the 3 orange Peri before me at once. But the king could only shake his head to his son, for he did not know where he could find such a thing. And the prince asked it again and again, but he saw in the look of the eyes of his parents that after all there was one thing he asked that they could not give to him. And day after day, he couldn't get out of his mind the thought of those 3 beautiful orange Peri. And so one day he turned to his father and he said, Ata, father, today I must leave you, for I must seek for something that I have longed for that I have never seen. I must go out and seek the 3 orange Peri. And so his mother and father, who had waited so long for their son, had to allow him to leave, for indeed they knew if he did not get what he asked for, he would die from despair. And so the young prince went out into the world. He took a high road which he climbed its steep slope. And at the top of the slope, he stopped in his tracks. For what did he see there? But Shaitan Hanum, the mother of all devils. There she stood high as a tower, with long white hair falling to her shoulders, and large black eyes that stared down at him. And his heart began to race. But in his fear he closed his eyes and he stretched out his arms until they became longer and longer and longer and longer, so they wrapped around the waist of the mother of all devils. And he cried out, Anna, mother, I have found you at last. And at those words, the large black eye of the mother of all devils welled up with tears, and a tear fell down her cheek and splashed over the prince like a waterfall. And she took the prince in her hand, and she smiled at him. No one, no stranger but you has called me mother. I will take you home with me. And so that is what she did. And so she brought the prince home with her. And as she arrived into her home, she turned the prince into a picture which she put on her shelf in her kitchen. And at that moment, boom, 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 in came her 12 sons, the 12 demons that wreaked havoc on the world each day. And as the first son went through the door, he sniffed. Anna, mother, I smell the blood of a son of Adam in this house. You smell no such thing, protested the mother of all devils. My son, you smell no such thing. All that you smell is what is stuck between your teeth. And so she gave her sons poles of wood to pick their teeth with. And as they picked their teeth, between their teeth there fell an arm and a leg. And when they saw this before their mother only shook her head with disappointment. For how many times had she told them? How many times had she told them not to snack before meals? And so she brought her sons to the table and served them their meat. And as she served them their meat, she asked them, my sons, if one of my children was of the son of Adam, how would you treat him? And one of her sons, with his mouth full, cried out, Anna, mother, we would treat him like our own brother. And then the 12 demons began to talk loudly and brag among themselves, brag of all the havoc they had reaped in the world. One of them began bragging how he pulverized a whole mountain with his own fist. But his brother beside him said it wasn't so. Was so, he said, wasn't so, was so, wasn't so. And one of them became so angry they reached for that clay pitcher on the shelf. And as he did so, the mother of all devils cried out, Yandinvar, what would you do? Would you kill your own brother? And at that moment, the clay pitcher turned back into the prince. And there were the 12 tall demons towering over the prince, who was their brother. Brother, said one of them to the prince, what is it that you seek in the world? And we will find it for you. And the prince looked at the 12 demons and he said, after all, I seek nothing other than the 3 orange Peri. Well, one of the demons had actually known where this was to be found, for he had heard about it on one of his journeys. And so he promised that the next day he would bring the prince to that very spot in the world where he could find the 3 orange Peri. And so the next day, that demon brought him to the gate of a garden. Go through that garden, he said to the prince, and you will find what you have been longing for. You will find what you look for. And so the prince went through the gate into that garden. And when he entered that garden, he discovered that that garden was exactly like the garden that surrounded his palace, except everything was in reverse. A tree he remembered over here in that garden was over there. A rose bush which he remembered over there in that garden was over here. And in the middle of that garden was a fountain of crystal clear water. And on the surface of the water there were 3 oranges that bobbed up and down, 3 oranges bright as gold. But each time the prince tried to reach for one of those oranges, it plunged to the depths of the fountain. And he tried again and again, and always the same thing would happen. Until one moment, without thinking, he brushed his hand over the fountain. And he caught one of those bright oranges. He did it again, and caught another. And one more time, he had the 3rd orange. And those 3 oranges he put in his pockets, and at once he left the garden. Now beyond the garden, there was a vast desert, and he crossed that desert, the sun forever beating on his back. He had walked a long distance when he felt his throat parched with thirst. And so he reached for that orange, waiting for its juice to quench his thirst. And he tore open that orange. From that orange there emerged a Peri, a beautiful Peri with long blue-black hair and eyes of sapphire. "Give me water. Give me water," said the Peri. But I don't have any water to give you," replied the prince. "Give me water. Give me water." And with those words, she disappeared. He walked further and further into that desert until another moment came when his thirst became unbearable. And he took that second orange and teared it open. And like before, that same beautiful Peri emerged. "Give me water," she said to him. "Give me water." "But I don't have any water to give you," he replied. "Give me water. Give me water." And with those words, she disappeared. The prince traveled further across that desert until he reached a point where the desert ended and there was a meadow of bright green grass beyond. And as he walked down that meadow, he came to the edge of a brook, at the shade of which there was a tree. He went to that brook and he satisfied his thirst. And he rested at the foot under the shade of that tree. And as he was making himself comfortable, he felt that last orange in his pocket. And he took that orange out of his pocket, tore it open, and then that same Peri emerged. But before she could say anything, there was the prince before her, his hands cupped with water for her to drink. And as she drank that water, he took the cape from around his back and wrapped her in it. And he said to her, "Now that I have put you in human clothes, I will hide you in the branches of the tree above. And I will go and come back, so I will give you the clothes worthy of my bride, the bride that I will present to my own parents." And so wrapping that cloak around her, he rose her up into the branches of that tree to hide her from the rest of the world, and went to the town to find bridal clothes for his new wife. Now where the prince left, the Peri, was not far from the home of a pasha, a general who had a daughter who thought a great deal of herself. She thought so much of herself that her mother made her wear around her wrist a mirror. But this wasn't any kind of mirror, for this mirror did not only show the face, it also showed the face behind the face. So that every day when the pasha's daughter went and had grand ideas of herself, she would only have to look on that mirror that was fastened to her wrist, and no otherwise. On that day, the pasha's daughter went to the brook, under that same tree. And when she looked into the water, she saw a face look back at her from the surface of the water. It was a beautiful face, framed by blue-black hair and eyes of sapphire. She thought this beautiful face must be her own, but when she looked at the mirror fastened to her wrist, she saw it wasn't so. Was so, wasn't so, was so, wasn't so, was so, wasn't so. And then all of a sudden, above her, she heard the rustling of leaves of that tree. And when she looked up, there was the face of the Peri, that beautiful face looking at her with such frightened eyes. "Come down, dearie," said the Pasha's daughter. And slowly the Peri descended from the tree. And the Pasha's daughter wrapped her arms around the Peri and rocked her back and forth, pleading to her, cajoling her, telling her to tell her her story. And the Peri told the Pasha's daughter everything. And the Pasha's daughter stroked her long black hair. And with a pin, with a single needle, she plunged it into that blue black hair. And the Peri gave such a terrible cry. And she stretched out her arms. And as she cried horribly in pain, her body became covered in feathers, feathers of bright red and orange. As she turned into a bright red bird that soared above and left the prince's cloak on the ground. And the Pasha's daughter wrapped herself up in the cloak and climbed up the trunk of that tree, waiting for the prince to return. And after a while, as the sun was setting, as the prince returned, it was too late to see what was in that bundle, in that cloak that he had left, that he just took it with him and carried it all the way home with him. And how happy, how proud he was when he arrived at the palace of his father, the Padishah. And he couldn't wait. He couldn't wait to introduce the Padishah to his new bride. But when he uncovered his cloak, he saw it wasn't her. And the Pasha's daughter saw all the disappointment in the prince's eyes. "It is the sun," she said. "It is the sun that has taken away all my beauty. Put me to bed at once, and when I am well, you will recognize me once again." And so that is what he did. And the days and weeks passed, and the best physicians in the world were brought to her bedside. But that face that he remembered had not returned to look back at him. Now during this time, in the kitchen of the palace, a strange thing happened every day. Every day the cook was preparing the pilaf for the royal table. And as she was doing so, a bird, a bright red bird with feathers, bright red and orange, flew in and rested on the windowsill. And the bird spoke to the cook, saying these words, "Who will the prince marry today? Who will the prince marry today?" And without waiting for an answer, the bird disappeared. This happened again and again. And then one evening, as the cook had finished everything and cleaned up everything, she left. She left the kitchen for the evening. But the next morning, when she woke up, all that had to be done for that day was prepared. The pilaf was cooked. The pots were scrubbed and cleaned. Everything was swept. At first she didn't know what had gone on. And then the next day it was the same thing, and the day after that. And so she decided that one evening she would not sleep to see what was happening in her kitchen when she was asleep. And that evening, when she crept into her kitchen in the middle of the night, there she saw her, a beautiful woman with long blue-black hair and eyes of sapphire, wrapped in a cloak, bright red. And there she was doing all the kitchen work for the cook. And then when the king approached her, she turned around frightened. "Daisy," she said, "please, please don't tell anyone anything." And the Peri told the cook all her story. And then the cook said to her, Tonight it will not be I, but you, who will serve the prince's royal pilaf." And so that evening, she served the prince his dinner. She wrapped herself in veils of bright red and orange. And the prince at his table was so sad, so distracted, that at first he did not notice that there was a new person serving him his dinner that evening. But then at the corner of his eye he turned around to see the new servant. Her face was half covered in a veil, but the prince could still see those eyes of sapphire, and it reminded him of someone. "Who are you?" he asked her. But she only trembled there. "Who are you?" I asked. "Answer me at once." But she began to tremble even more. So the prince rose up and tore that veil that covered half her face. And then the Peri began to weep. And he held her in his arms, rocking her back and forth, and as he did so, the Peri cried out, "I have died twice. I have died twice waiting to look upon your face once again. I have died twice." The prince held the Peri in his arms, and he said to her, "You will die no more, for in my arms you will have the human clothes you need to share my life with me." And so the prince married his beloved Peri, and the Pasha's daughter was duly punished. And Kirkegun Kirkegede, after 40 days and 40 nights of marriage celebrations, the prince opened his own gardens for all the public to see, to be invited to come into. And anyone who visited the prince's gardens from that day forward always left with the taste of butter and honey in their mouths.